Hi everybody, this is Stephen Pugh. I want to do another video number 15, on the subject of setting up and operating a circular saw. This video is going to pick up on the subject of the Spindle Mulder. Now the Spindle Mulder is a scary machine, okay? It's a very large machine, generally speaking. It has a very large steel bed, and it has a very big motor that spins exceptionally fast. Am I putting you off already? I hope so. It spins very fast. And it normally has a cutter block. There's various types of cutter blocks, but it has a cutter block in which there are bolted into it chunks of steel that have been super sharpened. So what can happen is this, is that when the machine is turned on and that cutter starts to spin, there can be quite substantial cutters. That shaped cutter, whatever that shape is, as timber is passed into it, so it molds the shape of that cutter into the timber. And that's why it's called a spindle molder. Okay, it's able to make molding. If you've got skirting with a particular shape, if you've got architrave with a particular shape, if you've got door items, connection molding, all these types of things, they can all be created on the spindle molder. Now the spindle molder in most workshops is operated by a very experienced joiner, and normally speaking in a workshop it's just one person or maybe two that sort of have the courage and the wisdom and the knowledge to be able to set this thing up. It has, I've talked about the spinning cutters, the spinning block. In front of them then is two fences that come together over the cutter block. Okay, and these fences can be adjusted wide and narrow. And also the fence can be adjusted forward and back. That means that you can adjust it in such a way that it takes off a small amount of cutting, then you can adjust it to take off a bit more and adjust it to take a bit more again. The big feature of the spindle molder is, and the general understanding of its use, in fact I think this is part of the regulations, I'm very sure it is that we use what's called a sacrificial fence. So a sacrificial fence then is a piece of timber, nice clean timber that's been planed, and it's attached to the fences that are already there. It may be attached by a bolt, or it may be actually just clamped in place. And then what happens is the machine is set up in such a way that as the machine is actually spinning, so the fence is pushed into the cutter until in the end a small aperture appears where the cutter's coming through the sacrificial fence. And when it's at exactly the right spot, the fences are then tightened down so they don't move. And then what we've got is we've got a complete piece of timber, okay, with a small cutout in the center, just enough for the cutter to come through. Now this is very important because this means that as you're passing timber through the spindle molder, so the timber can't accidentally grab hold of the cutter. Okay, there are lots of safety features in relation to this thing. One of the safety features is that you can have an automatic feed. So it's a large device that comes down. It looks like the tractors of a lorry. It's got large rubber wheels, and this can be adjusted and put in place so that when it's turned on, it will actually feed the wood in for you nice and safely. The only snag with that is this: it has to be just set up just right, and also it must be set up along the longest surface. So for example, if I had a piece of timber like this, I wouldn't want to be putting the feed roller on the top because it could tip over. I would want to put this feed roller on the largest surface. If I was feeding something through this way, I wouldn't put the feed roller here because it could tip. I put the feed roller on the top of it so that it's going to go through nice and safely. So this is how these things work. Most machines have little idiosyncrasies. Some of the machines have a tilting arbor so that the actual block can actually be turned over, sometimes up to 45 degrees, which I always think is amazing because, years and years ago, these types of operations never existed. The height adjustment is very important because this block can be raised or lowered, and there are 2 or 3 main ways whereby cutters are attached. Some use what's called a French head. A French head is a washer here and a washer at the top to match, and they have 2 slots in them, 2 slots at the top and 2 slots in the bottom, and the cutters fit into the slots, and then it's tightened down by a really big nut, and that holds the French heads in place. But the other way of having cutters is to have a large piece of steel. They're usually quite chunky and very thick and quite wide, about as big as this. And what they do, they have the profile already cut into them, and they come in pairs. So you always put the 2 in pairs. And some machines also have a little location hole, so that when you put the cutter in, it automatically locks in at the correct distance, like the same as the other one. And it's very important that you always put 2 or 3 or 4 in to match. If you don't put the full number of cutters in, then the machine can be offset and it'll wobble, and that then is highly dangerous. It's one of those machines, okay, it's one of those machines where you take a quick Valium before you start. It really is quite, it makes you think twice. It makes you think twice. When I'm working on one of these machines, by the way, I have what they call belt and braces. You can see I've got my braces here. What I do is I'll take a large sheet of material, say some 1.5 inch MDF, some really thick stuff, and I'll have a sheet in front of me standing between me and the machine, and it'll come up to just this height so that I can put my hands over it easily enough, but the cutter is down there. If anything ever went wrong, I would just lift my hands and any cutters that fly would hit the piece of wood in front of me. I wouldn't want them to go straight through me. I'd want them to hit a nice big piece of wood in front of me. So that's a little safety feature from me. Some profile cutters come already made, so the whole of the block comes as one piece with the cutters already embedded in it, and others come where the cutters are removable. Now the removable cutters, it is now a law that you have what's called a limiter. A limiter is a cutter that comes one way and another piece of steel that comes the other way, which prevents you from actually putting the timber in too much to be taken off at once. I think the limit is about 1.1 millimeters. I don't know whether you know this, but a millimeter is a tiny amount. It's the tiniest amount. Now, what that limiter does is it prevents you from actually using the machine and overloading it and asking it to take off too much material. Okay, so that's everything about machinery. We need to talk a little bit about timber and timber products and processes. There's lovely pictures here in this book about all the different timbers that are available. You've got white wood. Now, if you want to know what white wood is, it's just Christmas tree wood. You know what a Christmas tree is. Anyone that's ever done anything with a Christmas tree, if you have to cut it, you'll find that the timber is as white as a sheet of paper. That's called white wood. But then we have redwood. When you cut redwood, that's not really much darker than white wood, except that when ultraviolet light reaches it, it then turns a really deep red, whereas white wood doesn't. It always remains white, but redwood will turn this lovely deep honey colour. Then we have Douglas fir. Douglas fir is, well, all of these are softwoods. Douglas fir is beautiful, and it's really high, it's really expensive and high quality, and it's used for joinery products. That's Douglas fir. The next one then is cedar. Now cedar is a softwood for external use. The reason for that is that cedar has lots of natural resins in it which repel insects, and insects will not go anywhere near it to bore holes into it because of this strong pungent smell. Now it's very pungent to them, but it smells very nice to us. So it's a lovely smell. And traditionally, you know, shingles on a house are usually cedar or some other timber like that. There's also yellow pine, which is another expensive softwood, highly prized, has a beautiful grain and has lovely straight grain. It's called clear grade. Beech is lovely. Now beech is a hardwood. It's the preferred timber for tools. It's the preferred timber for boxes and for kitchen utensils and cutting boards and spoons and all these things. Beech is a lovely close grained timber. Oak is very strong hardwood, often referred to as the king of hardwoods. Very durable, usually heavy duty work, so timber framed houses, joinery, furniture. It is difficult to work. It is relatively hard. It's much easier to work when it's in its green state, and all timbers are much easier to work when they're wet. And then we have ash. Now you'll always recognize an ash tree when you're walking down the street, because it's grey in colour, a very smooth bark. It has little keys hanging off it. They look like a bunch of keys, and they're of course the seeds. Ash is beautiful to work. It's very, very good quality hardwood. It's the only timber, for those of you who are interested, that will burn when it's soaking wet. In fact, you can cut a tree down in the rain and ash will burn immediately. In fact, it'll actually dry itself as it's burning. Sapele. Now, sapele is a sort of mahogany. It's a type of mahogany. It's hardwood. It's a very distinctive, rich red colour, red and yellow, sometimes in stripes. And it's very durable, very easy to work with. Birch, very similar again, a hardwood used extensively in the manufacture of good quality plywood. If you talk about birch ply, you're talking about high grade plywood. Mahogany. Now mahogany is a deep, rich, red-brown colour, used mainly in the furniture industry for high-class furniture. Now then, we need to talk a little bit about growth rings, and we need to talk a little bit about growth. A tree grows in a most unusual way. The growth that occurs in a tree is just underneath the bark. In fact, there's a number of layers underneath the bark. Sometimes the bark is referred to as cork. You've got the cork cambium, you've got the phloem, yes, and the vascular cambium, and then the secondary xylem. Now, all these are very technical words. What it means is that the outside bark is growing at a particular rate, but from the inside, but the tree itself is also growing behind that. And between the two, you have the cambium layer. The cambium layer is where the real growth is occurring on both sides. Of course, when you cut a tree down, everybody knows that there are growth rings. And these growth rings are a very, very good indication of the age of a tree, because in the summertime, the vessels that are grown at the cambium layer are large and open, so that moisture, mineral water, can be pulled up from the ground and sent up into the tree, where in the leaves it is converted into the substances that are necessary to build the tree. Okay, but in the wintertime, these same vessels become much smaller. So every time you look at a tree, you'll see that you've got summer, winter on every ring. Okay, if it's a very, very bad winter, then the rings can be quite a long way apart. And if it's a very luscious summer, then sometimes that also can be. So you can get a good idea of how long a tree has been growing simply by counting the rings. The main wood on the outside of the tree, not on the bark, but just on the inside of the tree, the main timber is called sapwood. That's actually where sap goes up and down the tree. That's where the food is taken up out of the ground and is converted into energy. And on the inner side of the tree, there's another part which is called the heart. And in the heart is really all the strength of a tree. Some trees don't really have this, especially in places like in the tropics. You don't get the rings quite so obvious. In fact, they have what's called diffuse porous, where the rings don't really occur at all. The next thing we need to talk about is durability and workability and timber conversion. Now, conversion is a word that's used to describe what people do with just a tree trunk to convert it into usable items for construction or for use. And there are basically four types of conversion. The first one is called through and through, and with through and through, all that happens is that the saw, the timber's placed on the saw like that, and we do a saw cut and another saw cut and another saw cut and another saw cut until you have a series of planks. Okay, some saws go this way. You do a saw cut there, turn it down, another saw cut, and they keep doing it. So this is called through and through, and the saw just keeps going through, and then another cut, and another cut, and you end up with a series of planks. Okay, but there is another way of cutting. It's called tangential, and this is where they take a saw cut from there, okay, and then they turn it over and take a saw cut there, and then they turn it over again and do another saw cut, and they keep reducing it, and this gives a really good conversion of the timber into items of board that are excellent for use. Okay, there's another way of doing this, and that's called quarter sawn. So they get the timber and they cut the log into four, just cut it into four, and then they take those quarters and they cut them again. They either cut them this way or they cut them this way across here at this angle. The reason for that is because if they're quarter sawing, they're looking for particular features in the grain of the timber that is only found in that particular operation. And then there's another way of cutting, which is called boxed heart. Sometimes in the tree, the middle of it is rotten. So they'll take a saw cut just on this side of the rotten wood and a saw cut onto that side of the rotten wood. Then they'll take them apart and do a saw cut there and a saw cut there. And then the rest of these pieces are then sawn up into parts. And that is a way of using timber that is rotten in the center. Okay, so the size of boards. Now the size of boards has always been a little bit of a mystery to me as to how people decide what size of board should be. For width of a board, it can go like this: 150 millimeters, that's 6 inches, to 200 millimeters, and then 225 millimeters, which is 9 inches, and 250 millimeters. So that's the width of boards. They come in those basic sizes. Now for the thickness of boards, they can be 25 millimeters, 32, 50, 63, 70, and 100 millimeters. And as for length, boards generally come in different sizes. They come as a 1.8, a 2.1, a 2.4, 2.7, 3 meters, 3.3, 3.6, 3.9, 4.2, 4.5, 4.8, 5.1 and 5.4. Now I presume you can remember all that. No, I don't think you can really. No, it's one of these things. It's one of these things that I find it very difficult to remember obscure, unrelated things. But that's it. That's the widths and that's the thickness of boards. Now the next question we need to think about with timber conversion is drying. Okay, because when a tree is cut down, it can be full up with water and sap. It can be as much as 200% of its dry weight. Okay, got that now? 200% of its dry weight. So there's an awful lot of water in there then, and that water needs to be extracted. And the most difficult and the obvious way to do that is to just put the timber into what I call a dry shed. So it's a shed, okay? But in this shed, it's got a roof on it. In this shed, there's no walls. So all the timber's stacked up inside the shed, and it's just left there for 3 years or 2 years sometimes. And the wind blows through it and the sun beats down, but it's not beating on the wood because it's got a roof. And it doesn't rain on it because there's a roof. It doesn't snow on it because there's a roof. And so the timber gets drier and drier and drier, and it takes about a couple of years for that timber to be seasoned. And that timber will dry out and dry out and dry out until it's down to about only 20% of the moisture okay, 20% or less of the moisture that it started off as. Okay, and that's what we call drying, or actually the proper word is seasoning. Right, wow, there's a lot to learn, isn't there, about timber. The next thing we need to know about is stress grading. So this is where you have a machine and the timber's constantly fed in the one end by people and constantly taken out the other end, and as it goes through the machine, so there are rollers. Okay, as the timber goes through, it rolls over it, and these rollers are set up so that they're pressing down on the timber. They're constantly assessing to see how much strength it takes to deform that timber. And then with a computer inside, it works out how strong the wood is, and it sprays a number on the side of the wood telling you exactly how strong it is and what quality it is. And so that's why, I don't know whether you're aware of this, but all timber comes graded, and it's graded from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And each of those grades is a different stress, a different strength. That's the point, different strength. So when you're picking up a piece of CLS next time, have a look at what the writing is that it says on the side of the wood. Okay, types of manufactured board. Now we all know that there's board. Okay, we can talk about MDF, chipboard, OSB, hardboard, all the different types. Let's go through some of them and talk about what they actually are and what they're made of and what they can be used for. The first one and the most common is MDF. MDF stands for medium density fiberboard. There's also a high density fiberboard, HDF, and there's also an SDF, soft density fiberboard. Soft density fiberboard is sometimes called insulation board, and in fact people used to buy it just used to make pin boards. It was the sort of thing where you could put a pin in it and it would be fine because it was quite soft. So medium density fiberboard, you can't put a pin in that, it's actually quite strong. And there's two different types of medium density fiberboard. There's ordinary medium density fiberboard, MDF, and then there's high grade and waterproof MDF. So this high grade waterproof MDF, you could put it in a bucket of water for 10 years and it still wouldn't get wet. So that's because as the fibers are glued together, because everything in MDF is glued together, what they do is they turn the wood into a pulp so fine, nearly as fine as what you'd find in cardboard. In fact, I often say that MDF is just a very thick cardboard. That's what it is. And sometimes the glue that they use is actually a waterproof glue. So that waterproof glue means that that MDF can be used where there's rain or where there's moisture. Then of course the chipboard. Now we all know what chipboard looks like. It's just chipboard. It's made of fairly small chips of timber, and I live quite near to the company that makes most of this in the UK. It's just a few miles up the road here, and they go through millions upon millions upon millions of sheets of this every day. You wouldn't believe it if you saw it. And yes, they make chipboard. So it's the wood is chipped into little tiny chips, and then it goes through a press, and as it's going through the press continually, the glue is mixed in with it, and as it comes out the other side, it's heated, and then they just cut into boards. These all boards come out of the machine red hot. They come out completely as hot, you can't put your hand on it, and then they're put into stacks. And it takes a while for all the heat in that stack to finally dissipate. In fact, one of the problems of making board material is the problem of automatic burning. And the stacks are so huge sometimes that they just start a fire inside them. The fire just automatically combusts, and away it goes. And so they spend an awful lot of money, awful lot of money, with fire control, making sure these things don't burst into flames. And then we have OSB. Now OSB is fantastic. It's chipboard for men. It's very large chips. I mean, the chips are this big and they're all squashed together and a bit of glue, and they're turned into a board. and it's excellent material. It is a little bit rough and ready, but it's good. Okay, let's look at a few more. You've got plywood. Now, we all know what plywood is. One of the things that people don't realize is that plywood is a series of layers of timber all crossing over. Every layer crosses over the previous and crosses over the previous, and they always use an odd number of layers. So it's either a 3 or a 5 or a 7 and so on. And the bigger the number of layers, the more expensive it is. Okay, and there's also another type of plywood which is almost identical to what we just talked about, but it's called marine ply. Now, marine ply, or WBP ply, is water boiled proof. Water boil proof. So you could get some of this plywood that's water boil proof. You could put it in a bucket and heat it till it's boiling, and that boiling water would not undo the glue. That's the point. It's the glue that is water and boil proof. The timber will swell a bit and stuff, but the main thing is it won't come undone. Okay, that's a particularly good thing. Now, with plywood, there's lots of varieties. I mean, you've got 3s and 4s and 7s and 9s and 5s, but the important thing is they have different finishes on them. Some have a really high grade finish. One of my favorite forms of plywood is plywood that has a surface of veneered oak. I love it, and so I'll always buy that, and it's quite expensive, and I make furniture in my pastime with that. Now we have hardboard. Hardboard is very, very similar. It's one of the earlier products. It's actually timber that's been pulped to it's almost like as if they're going to be making cardboard. That's how much pulped up it is, and then it's injected with, generally speaking, okay, it's injected with an oil or an adhesive that's quite waterproof. Some of them are actually waterproof, and some of them are quite waterproof. You get them in different thicknesses, quite thin and to quite thick. Some of them are so bullet hard you can't get a nail through them. You know, that's the sort of quality you sometimes get with hardboard. So it's really, really very good strength, low cost, and there we are. And then the last one, the one that everybody knows about, is called Birch Ply. So this is plywood that's made out of birch, and it is super. It is one of the best plywoods you can get. There's virtually no knots in it. It usually has quite a lot of layers, usually 7 or 9 or more, and the more layers the better. And this is very high quality, and it's used for high class furniture. There are also a number of others which you may need to know about, but we'll mention them just now. First of all, there's one called Flexi Ply. So this is very unusual. This is a plywood, usually in 3 layers, where instead of the timbers being less crosswise like this, they're all put in the same layer each time. And this means that you then can bend it. It will actually bend very easily. It'll go into even quite a tight circle. And for some projects, for some things, that's particularly handy. And then, of course, there's various other types of board. I won't go into all of them. There's lamin board, which is basically a series of vertical strips of wood, okay, all let side by side, and a sheet of timber on each side, okay? And then, of course, there's blockboard. Now, blockboard is a little rougher than lamin board, and it's just little blocks of timber. It looks like little blocks, but actually they're long strips of timber. And then, of course, another sheet on the top and another sheet on the bottom. These boards, there's lots of different varieties of these boards, and these boards are particularly good for general carpentry purposes. Well, there we are. That's a big long lesson, isn't it? That didn't take too long. We're going to catch up with video number 16 next time, where we're going to talk about timber defects. So we look forward to seeing you then. See you later. Bye.